He laughed in court, humiliating his wife, certain he had already won. Seconds later, the courtroom fell silent as her father entered with the judge. The courtroom smelled of old wood and older money. Mahogany panels lined the walls like the ribs of a dying beast, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the kind of quiet menace that made witnesses sweat before they even took the stand. Dan Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table like a king surveying his kingdom. His $40,000 Brioni suit was pressed to perfection. His Patek Philippe glinted under the lights. His legal team, 7 of Manhattan's most ruthless divorce attorneys, flanked him like a private army. Across the aisle, a single woman sat alone, Carla. She wore a simple gray dress from a department store clearance rack. No jewelry, no makeup to hide the sleepless circles under her eyes. Her public defender, a kid who looked fresh out of law school, shuffled papers with trembling hands. Dan turned to his lead attorney and whispered loud enough for the gallery to hear, "This will be over by lunch. She doesn't even have a real lawyer." He was right about one thing. It would be over by lunch, but not the way he imagined. Because in exactly 47 minutes, a door would open, and a man Dan Whitmore had never seen before would walk in alongside the judge. A man whose name made governors return phone calls. A man whose signature appeared on the deed to the building they were sitting in. A man who happened to be Carla's father. This is the story of how a billionaire's arrogance wrote a check his empire couldn't cash. 6 years earlier, Dan Whitmore was not yet a billionaire. He was a hungry real estate developer with $2 million in debt, a crumbling portfolio of strip malls in New Jersey, and a desperate need for capital. He found Carla working the front desk at a small accounting firm in Queens. She was 24, quiet, unremarkable in the way that made her invisible to most men. She wore her brown hair in a practical ponytail. She brought her lunch in a brown paper bag. She never complained when she had to stay late. Dan didn't notice her beauty because, frankly, he wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for a wife who would ask no questions, expect no romance, and provide the stable domestic image that old money investors like to see. Married men get better interest rates, his mentor had told him. Banks trust a man with a wife. It means he's got something to lose. So Dan took Carla to dinner at a mid-tier Italian restaurant in Astoria. He ordered the cheapest wine on the menu and told her she was special. He told her he saw something in her that nobody else did. He told her he wanted to build a life together. What he meant was, he wanted to build an empire. She was just the scaffolding. Carla said yes because nobody had ever called her special before. They married at City Hall on a Tuesday afternoon. Dan was on a conference call for the first 20 minutes of their reception, which consisted of cake from a grocery store and champagne that cost $11. Their honeymoon was 3 days at a bed and breakfast in Vermont. Dan spent most of it on his laptop, crunching numbers for a deal that would change everything. And it did. 3 months after their wedding, Dan closed his first major acquisition, a failing shopping center in Westchester that he flipped for a $4 million profit. The money was good, but the connections were better. Suddenly, doors that had been closed to him swung open. The struggling developer from Jersey City became a name people recognized. And Carla? Carla became the woman who answered his phone when he was too busy. The woman who packed his suitcase for business trips. The woman who ate dinner alone while he attended galas with investors and politicians, and the kind of women who wore dresses that cost more than Carla's annual salary at the accounting firm. "I need you to understand something," Dan told her one night, 3 years into their marriage. He was standing in the doorway of their new penthouse on the Upper East Side, adjusting his cufflinks. "My world is complicated. These events, these people, they're not your world, Carla. You'd be uncomfortable. It's better if you stay home." Carla looked up from the book she was reading. "I could learn," she said quietly. "I could—" "You could embarrass me," Dan interrupted. His voice wasn't cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was dismissive. "You don't know how to talk to these people. You don't know which fork to use at a 5-course dinner. You don't know the difference between a Rothko and a Pollock. And frankly, I don't have time to teach you." He left without saying goodbye. Carla sat in the silence of their $30 million apartment and wondered when she had become furniture. The affairs started in year 4. Dan wasn't subtle about them. He didn't need to be. Carla had no family she spoke of, no friends who might intervene, no money that wasn't technically his. She was, in his estimation, completely contained. The first was a marketing executive named Sloan, blonde, ambitious, with a laugh like shattering crystal. Dan brought her to a charity gala where Carla was supposed to attend. He introduced Sloan as his business partner, while Carla stood 3 feet away, holding a glass of champagne she never drank. "Your wife seems nice," Sloan said later, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "In a mousy sort of way." Dan laughed. "She serves a purpose." The words traveled back to Carla through the whisper network of society wives who found her pitiable enough to warn. She heard them all. She absorbed them like blows to soft tissue, the kind that don't leave visible bruises. But Carla didn't leave. She couldn't explain why, even to herself. Maybe it was the fear of starting over with nothing. Maybe it was the tiny dying hope that the man who had called her special in that Italian restaurant still existed somewhere inside the monster he was becoming. Or maybe, and this was the thing Dan never considered, she was waiting. Waiting for what, she didn't know. But something inside her, something quiet and patient and older than her years, told her to stay, to watch, to remember everything. So she did. She remembered the names of every woman he paraded through their life. She remembered the dates, the hotels, the jewelry he bought them with money that was technically marital property. She remembered the business dinners where he introduced her as "my wife" in a tone that made it sound like a medical condition. She remembered everything, and she said nothing. Then came Meredith. Meredith Callahan was different from the others. She wasn't a fling or a distraction. She was a strategic acquisition. 29 years old, Stanford MBA, family money from Connecticut. Father sat on the board of 3 Fortune 500 companies. She was everything Dan wanted in a wife. Connected, polished, impressive. She was also engaged to someone else when Dan met her at a real estate conference in Miami. That engagement lasted approximately 6 weeks after their introduction. "I'm going to marry her," Dan announced to Carla one evening over dinner. He said it the way someone might announce they were buying a new car. "I've already had my lawyers draw up the papers. I'm being generous. You'll get the apartment in Queens, a small settlement, and we can do this quietly." Carla set down her fork. "The apartment in Queens? The one I bought as an investment property. It's worth maybe $600,000. You can sell it, live comfortably, find someone more suited to your lifestyle, and everything else. The properties, the accounts, the mine," Dan said simply. "Everything was built by me, Carla. You were along for the ride. Don't pretend you contributed something." Carla stared at him. For a long moment she didn't speak. Dan mistook her silence for defeat. "I'll have the papers sent over tomorrow," he continued, returning to his steak. "Sign them quickly. Meredith's family wants to announce the engagement by spring, and I'd prefer not to have any complications." "And if I don't sign?" Dan looked up. For the first time in years, he actually looked at her. His eyes were cold, amused, like a cat watching a mouse pretend it had claws. "Then I'll bury you in litigation until you're begging for the Queen's apartment. I have 7 lawyers, Carla, the best in the city." "You have what? A savings account I could drain in legal fees before the first hearing?" He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never lost. "Don't fight me on this. You won't win. You can't win. You're nobody. You came from nothing, and you'll go back to nothing. The only question is whether you go back with $600,000 or with absolutely zero." He stood up, tossing his napkin onto his plate. "I'll give you a week to decide. But honestly, Carla, I don't know why you'd even hesitate. This is the most valuable you've ever been to me, as something I can get rid of." He walked out of the dining room, leaving Carla alone with cold food and the echo of his contempt. What Dan didn't see, because he never bothered to look, was the expression on Carla's face after he left. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't despair. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like relief, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment, as if a door she had kept locked for 6 years had finally opened. The Manhattan family court building sat on Center Street like a gray bureaucratic tombstone. Carla had passed it 1,000 times during her years in the city without ever imagining she would walk through its doors as a plaintiff, or technically as a defendant. Dan had filed first, a preemptive strike designed to control the narrative. His petition read like a character assassination disguised as legal documentation. Carla was described as financially unsophisticated, emotionally unstable, and wholly dependent on the marriage for sustenance she did not earn. The filing requested full ownership of all marital assets, cited her failure to contribute meaningfully to the household, and included an affidavit from a psychiatrist Dan had paid to suggest, without ever examining Carla, that she was likely suffering from dependent personality disorder. It was, in the words of the legal community, a sledgehammer approach. Dan wanted more than a divorce. He wanted annihilation. He wanted Carla to leave this marriage so thoroughly destroyed that she would never dare speak his name again. His legal team was led by Victor Ashworth, a man whose nickname in Manhattan legal circles was The Undertaker. Victor had handled divorces for hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, and at least 2 members of foreign royal families. His record was immaculate. His methods were brutal. His fees started at $2,000 an hour. "This will be the easiest case of my career," Victor told Dan the morning of the preliminary hearing. "She's got a public defender who graduated law school 18 months ago. She has no documentation of hidden assets because, frankly, there are no hidden assets. Everything is in your name, structured through your corporations, protected by the prenuptial agreement she signed without legal counsel." Dan nodded, sipping his espresso. "What about the adultery? Can she use that?" Victor shrugged. "New York is a no-fault state. Adultery is legally irrelevant to asset division. She can cry about your affairs all she wants. It won't move the needle on the settlement. And the prenup? Ironclad. She waived rights to any business assets, accepted a cap on alimony at $50,000 total, and agreed that any challenge to the agreement would require her to cover your legal fees if unsuccessful." Victor smiled. "You had this plan from the beginning, didn't you?" Dan set down his coffee. "I had everything planned from the beginning. Carla was a calculated decision, a placeholder. Now the calculation has changed, and she's no longer useful." "Cold," Victor observed with something like admiration. "Efficient," Dan corrected. "Now let's go end this." Carla arrived at the courthouse alone. She took the subway, the same subway she had taken to work every day before Dan convinced her to quit her job to focus on the home. She wore the gray dress because it was the nicest thing she owned that didn't have Dan's money attached to it. Her lawyer, a young man named Peter Huang, met her outside the courtroom looking like he might vomit. "Mrs. Whitmore." Carla. Peter swallowed hard. "I have to be honest with you. I've reviewed their filings and it's bad, really bad. The prenuptial agreement alone. I know what I signed. They're arguing you're entitled to almost nothing. The Queen's apartment and $50,000 total. That's it, for 6 years of marriage." Carla looked at the young lawyer. He reminded her of herself at that age, eager to help, terrified of failing, completely out of his depth. "Peter," she said quietly, "have you ever heard the phrase, 'let them underestimate you'?" Peter blinked. What? "Never mind." Carla shouldered her bag. "Let's go inside." The courtroom was already occupied when they entered. Dan sat at the plaintiff's table like Caesar at the Colosseum, surrounded by his 7 lawyers in their matching charcoal suits. Meredith Callahan sat in the front row of the gallery, her diamond engagement ring catching the light every time she moved her hand, which was often. The gallery itself was scattered with journalists. Dan had made sure of that. He wanted this divorce to be public, to establish the narrative before Carla could speak. The headlines were already written in his head. "Billionaire developer frees himself from gold-digging wife." When Carla walked in, a murmur rippled through the room. Not of sympathy, of pity. She looked exactly like what Dan had described in his filings. Small, overwhelmed, defeated. Dan turned to Victor and whispered, "This is almost too easy." "Don't get cocky," Victor murmured back. "Judges don't like arrogance. Judge Harrison is 63 years old, 18 months from retirement, and thinking about his golf game in Florida. He'll rubber stamp whatever we put in front of him." As if on cue, the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Robert Harrison presiding." Everyone stood, but Judge Harrison didn't walk through the door. Instead, the bailiff frowned, looked at a note that had been handed to him, and cleared his throat. There appears to be a change in the docket. Judge Harrison has recused himself from this matter due to a potential conflict of interest. A replacement has been assigned. Dan's brow furrowed. Conflict of interest? What conflict of interest? Victor was already pulling out his phone, texting his paralegal team. I don't know. Give me a minute. The bailiff continued. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Vance Thornwood. A door behind the bench opened. The woman who walked through was not what anyone expected. Judge Patricia Vance Thornwood was 71 years old with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen every variety of human dishonesty the legal system could produce. She had been on the bench for 38 years, had written opinions that were studied in law schools across the country, and had a reputation for one thing above all else. She despised being lied to. She took her seat, arranged her papers, and looked out at the courtroom. Her gaze swept past Dan, past his legal army, past the journalists, and landed on Carla. For just a moment, something flickered in the judge's eyes. Recognition? Warmth? It was gone before anyone could name it. This court is now in session, Judge Vance Thornwood announced. I understand we're here for Whitmore versus Whitmore. Counsel, please state your appearances. Victor stood, buttoning his jacket. Victor Ashworth of Ashworth, Sterling and Moore, representing the plaintiff, Daniel Whitmore. Peter Huang rose on shaking legs. Peter Huang, Legal Aid Society, representing the defendant, Carla Whitmore. The judge nodded. Mr. Ashworth, I've reviewed your filings. You may proceed with your opening statement. Victor moved to the center of the courtroom like a shark who had scented blood. Your Honor, this is a simple case. My client, Daniel Whitmore, is a self-made businessman who built an empire from nothing. The defendant, Carla Whitmore, was a clerical worker when they met. She contributed nothing to the marital estate, no income, no business acumen, no significant domestic labor beyond basic household maintenance. He gestured toward Carla without looking at her. The prenuptial agreement, signed freely and without coercion, clearly establishes that marital assets acquired through my client's business activities remain his sole property. The defendant is entitled to the settlement specified in that agreement, a residential property valued at approximately $600,000 and a one-time payment of $50,000. Victor paused for effect. We are not here to debate whether this marriage was happy. We are here to enforce a contract. And contracts, Your Honor, are the foundation of civilized society. The defendant knew what she was signing. She accepted the terms. Now she must live with them. He returned to his seat, satisfied. Judge Vance Thornwood turned to Peter. Mr. Huang, your response? Peter stood. His voice cracked on the first word. Your Honor, my client, that is, Mrs. Whitmore, she has been a faithful spouse for 6 years. The prenuptial agreement was presented to her 48 hours before the wedding, without independent legal counsel, under circumstances that could be considered, he checked his notes, coercive. Could be considered? Victor interjected. Your Honor, that's speculation, not Mr. Ashworth. The judge's voice was ice. You will have your opportunity to respond. Interrupt again, and I will hold you in contempt. The courtroom went silent. Victor's face reddened, but he nodded. Continue, Mr. Huang. Peter fumbled forward. We are requesting that the court consider the totality of circumstances. The years of verbal degradation, the documented infidelity, the systematic isolation of my client from potential support systems. The documented infidelity? Victor couldn't help himself. Your Honor, New York is a no-fault. Mr. Ashworth. Judge Vance Thornwood removed her glasses. What did I just say? I apologize, Your Honor. You apologize, and yet you immediately did exactly what I told you not to do. That suggests your apology is worthless. She made a note. Continue, Mr. Huang, and take your time. This court has all day. Peter looked at Carla. She gave him a small nod. Your Honor, we are requesting discovery, full financial discovery. We believe there are assets that have been concealed, accounts that have been hidden, properties held through shell corporations specifically designed to circumvent the prenuptial agreement. Dan actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that echoed in the courtroom. Judge Vance Thornwood's eyes moved to him. Something amusing, Mr. Whitmore? Dan composed himself. Apologies, Your Honor. It's just, there are no hidden assets. Every property, every account, every investment is documented. My financial records have been reviewed by the IRS, by institutional investors, by Mr. Whitmore. You are not on the stand and you have not been asked to testify. Speak out of turn again and I will clear this courtroom of everyone except essential parties. The judge's voice could have frozen the Hudson. Do I make myself clear? Dan's jaw tightened. Yes, Your Honor. Good. She turned back to Peter. Mr. Huang, your request for discovery is reasonable. I'm granting it. Mr. Ashworth, your client will provide full financial disclosure within 30 days. Bank statements, property deeds, corporate filings, investment accounts, all of it. Victor stood. Your Honor, with respect, the prenuptial agreement clearly... I've read the prenuptial agreement, Mr. Ashworth. I've also read the circumstances under which it was signed. A 24-year-old clerical worker with no legal representation, presented with complex legal documents 48 hours before her wedding by a man who was, at the time, her only significant relationship. She paused. That agreement may or may not be enforceable, but I will make that determination based on complete information, not on whatever selective documentation your team has chosen to present. The color drained from Victor's face. Dan leaned over and hissed. What the hell is happening? I don't know, Victor whispered back. This judge wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't the plan. Judge Vance Thornwood checked her watch. We'll recess for 15 minutes. When we return, I want to hear from the defendant herself. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you are prepared to testify. She banged her gavel once. Court is in recess. The 15-minute recess was chaos on Dan's side of the courtroom. Victor Ashworth had his entire team on their phones, trying to figure out how Judge Harrison had been replaced, and more importantly, what Judge Vance Thornwood's angle was. She's been on the bench for almost 40 years, one associate reported. Hard as nails. Fair but brutal if you're hiding something. I'm not hiding anything, Dan snapped. Then why are you sweating? Dan turned to Victor. Get me off this case, file for a different venue. Claim bias. Claim on what grounds? She hasn't done anything improper. She's just thorough. Victor loosened his tie. Look, this is a setback, not a disaster. Your financials are clean. Let them dig. They won't find anything. Dan said nothing, but for the first time since filing for divorce, he felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Doubt. Across the aisle, Carla sat perfectly still. Peter was talking rapidly, something about strategy and cross-examination preparation, but she wasn't listening. She was watching the door to the judge's chambers. Carla, are you listening? Yes, Peter. When you testify, stick to the facts. Don't get emotional. Don't let them provoke you. Ashworth is going to try to paint you as unstable, as a gold digger who... Peter. He stopped. Carla turned to look at him. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A stillness. A depth. I need you to trust me, she said quietly. When I get on that stand, I'm going to say some things that might not make sense at first. But I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Peter stared at her. Carla, this isn't a game. You could lose everything. I could, she agreed, but I won't. How do you know? Carla smiled. It was a small smile, gentle, almost sad. Because I've been waiting for this day for 6 years. Before Peter could respond, the bailiff called the court back to order. Mrs. Whitmore, please take the stand. Carla rose from her seat. Every eye in the courtroom followed her as she walked to the witness box, was sworn in, and took her seat. From this angle, she could see everything. Dan's barely concealed contempt, Meredith's smug satisfaction, the journalist's hungry anticipation of drama, and Judge Vance Thornwood's steady, unreadable gaze. Peter approached. Mrs. Whitmore, Carla, can you describe the circumstances under which you signed the prenuptial agreement? Carla leaned toward the microphone. I was 24 years old. I was working as a receptionist at an accounting firm in Queens, making $32,000 a year. Dan and I had been dating for 3 months. He proposed, and I said yes. 2 days before the wedding, he handed me a stack of papers and told me to sign them. Did you have a lawyer review the documents? No. Dan said it was a formality. He said all successful couples had prenuptial agreements. He said if I loved him, I would trust him. And you signed. I signed. Carla's voice was steady. I was young. I was in love. I believed him when he said he would take care of me. Dan shifted in his seat. This was going exactly as he expected. The sob story, the victimhood. The jury, if this were a jury trial, would feel sorry for her, and then they'd read the law and realize feelings don't matter. Victor stood. Your Honor, may I cross-examine? You may. Victor approached the stand with the confidence of a surgeon about to perform a routine procedure. Mrs. Whitmore, you testified that you signed the prenuptial agreement because you trusted your husband. Is that correct? Yes. And in the 6 years since, did you ever attempt to have that agreement reviewed by a lawyer? No. Did you ever express to your husband that you felt the agreement was unfair? No. Did you, in fact, live a lifestyle during your marriage that most people would describe as luxurious? Carla paused. I lived in a penthouse I wasn't allowed to decorate. I wore clothes Dan picked out for me. I attended events where I was introduced as Dan's wife, never by my own name. I had access to money but no control over it. So yes, Mr. Ashworth, I suppose from the outside, it looked luxurious. Victor smiled. But you didn't leave. Despite this alleged unhappiness, you stayed. I stayed. Because you enjoyed the lifestyle, the money, the status. Carla looked at him. No, Mr. Ashworth, I stayed because I was taught that when you make a commitment, you honor it, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. I stayed because I believed my husband might change. I stayed because I hoped that the man who proposed to me in that Italian restaurant still existed somewhere. She paused. I was wrong, but I don't apologize for hoping. Victor's smile flickered. This wasn't the fragile, easily manipulated witness he'd been promised. Mrs. Whitmore, let's discuss your contributions to the marriage. During the past 6 years, did you hold any form of employment? No. Did you generate any income? No. Did you manage any of your husband's business affairs? I was not permitted to. Permitted. That's an interesting word choice. Were you physically prevented from working? I was told that my working would embarrass Dan, that wives of successful men don't have jobs, that my role was to manage the household and support his career. And did you manage the household? I managed a household that was also managed by a housekeeper, a chef, a driver, and a personal assistant. My management consisted of existing in a space where I had no actual function. Victor circled. So you admit you contributed nothing tangible to the marriage? Carla's eyes never left his. I contributed everything I was allowed to contribute. And when I tried to contribute more, I was told I wasn't needed. You were told? By whom? By my husband. And you simply accepted that? Have you ever been trapped, Mr. Ashworth? Carla's voice was quiet but carried through the courtroom. Not physically, emotionally, financially. Have you ever woken up one day and realized that the person you trusted has built walls around you so slowly, so carefully, that you didn't notice until you couldn't climb out? Victor hesitated. I didn't accept it, Carla continued. I survived it. There's a difference. The courtroom was silent. Dan leaned forward and whispered urgently to Victor. Victor nodded and returned to his attack. Mrs. Whitmore, are you aware that your husband has filed extensive documentation of your alleged emotional instability? I'm aware of the lies he paid someone to write, yes. You're accusing a licensed psychiatrist of lying? I'm stating that I have never met the psychiatrist whose name appears on that report. I was never examined. The evaluation was conducted entirely based on information provided by my husband. Victor glanced at the judge. This was supposed to be a kill shot, but Carla had deflected it without even raising her voice. Your Honor, I move to admit Exhibit 47A, the psychiatric evaluation of denied. Judge Vance Thornwood didn't even look up from her notes. An evaluation conducted without the subject's presence or consent is not admissible. Did your team not do basic research, Mr. Ashworth? Victor's face reddened. Your Honor, move on. The cross-examination continued for another 40 minutes, but the momentum had shifted. Every trap Victor laid, Carla stepped around. Every accusation he made, she absorbed without breaking. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She answered each question with the calm precision of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for years. By the time Victor returned to his seat, Dan was gripping the edge of the table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. "I don't know," Victor admitted. "She was supposed to fall apart. She's making me look like the villain." "You are the villain," Victor didn't say. Instead, "We still have the prenup. We still have the asset structure. She can talk all she wants. The law's on our side." Dan nodded, but the doubt in his chest had grown into something heavier. Judge Vance Thornwood looked at the clock. "We'll take a lunch recess. Court will reconvene at 2 p.m. At that time, I expect to address the matter of financial discovery and any additional witnesses either party wishes to call." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned." The lunch hour passed in two very different ways. Dan commandeered a private conference room in the courthouse, surrounded by his legal team and enough food to feed 20 people, though no one was eating. "I want everything on this judge," Dan commanded. "Her history, her cases, her rulings. Find something we can use. A bias, a conflict, anything." "She's clean," one associate reported. 38 years on the bench. Never been overturned by appellate. Never been censured. She's considered one of the most respected family court judges in the state. "Then why is she treating me like a criminal?" "Because you've been acting like one," Victor didn't say. Instead, "She's thorough, that's all. Once we get through discovery, the prenup will hold. The assets are structured properly. There's nothing to find." Dan stood by the window looking down at Center Street. Below, he could see Carla sitting on a bench outside the courthouse, eating a sandwich from a brown paper bag. Just like when they first met. For a moment, just a moment, Dan felt something that might have been regret. Then Meredith walked into the conference room, and the feeling vanished. "Darling," she kissed his cheek. "How are we doing? Is the little mouse crying yet?" "Not yet," Dan admitted, "but she will. She better. Daddy's getting impatient about the announcement. He wants to see divorce papers before he'll commit to the spring engagement party." Dan pulled her close. "By end of day, this will be over, I promise." He had no idea how right he was. At 1:55 p.m., Carla returned to the courtroom and took her seat beside Peter. "Are you ready?" Peter asked. "Almost." Carla checked her phone. A single text message glowed on the screen. 5 minutes. She put the phone away. Peter frowned. "Carla, what's going on? You've been calm all day, but you're acting like you know something I don't." Carla looked at him. "Peter, do you believe in justice?" Yes, of course." "Then believe that sometimes justice takes time, and sometimes it arrives exactly when it's supposed to." Before Peter could respond, the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise." Judge Vance Thornwood took her seat. "Court is now in session. Before we proceed with discovery matters, I understand there may be additional witnesses." Victor stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has no additional witnesses. We believe the case has been made." The judge turned to Peter. "Mr. Huang?" Peter looked at Carla. She gave a slight nod. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call one witness, someone who can speak to the circumstances of the marriage and the character of both parties." Dan frowned. Who would testify for Carla? She had no friends, no family. He had made sure of that. "Name your witness," the judge said. Peter looked at his notes. "The defense calls Raymond Vance Thornwood." The courtroom went silent. Dan turned to Victor. "Who?" Victor's face had gone white. He didn't answer. A door at the back of the courtroom opened. The man who walked through was 73 years old with silver hair and a bearing that commanded attention without demanding it. He wore a simple navy suit, not flashy, not expensive looking, but somehow more elegant than anything in Dan's closet. He walked down the center aisle with the measured pace of someone who had never needed to hurry in his life. Dan watched him approach, trying to place the face, the name. Vance Thornwood, the same name as the judge. The man passed Dan's table without a glance. But as he passed Carla, he paused. His hand reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Ready?" he asked softly. "Yes, Daddy," Carla replied. Dan's world stopped. Raymond Vance Thornwood took the witness stand. Victor Ashworth was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." This witness was not disclosed in discovery. We have no documentation of any relationship between. Sit down, Mr. Ashworth. Judge Vance Thornwood's voice was calm. The witness is my husband, and before you file for my recusal, you should know that I disclosed this relationship to the court administrator this morning and offered to step aside. Both parties were notified. Your team apparently didn't read the memo. Victor scrambled through his papers. An associate leaned over and whispered frantically, We didn't receive. It was sent at 8:47 a.m. Shall I have the court administrator confirm the delivery receipt? Victor sat down slowly. His face was the color of old newspaper. Dan grabbed his arm. What's happening? Who is that man? Victor turned to him with eyes that held something Dan had never seen before. Fear. That, Victor whispered, is Raymond Vance Thornwood. He's the founder of Vance Capital Holdings. He owns, well, everything. Banks, real estate, shipping, media. He's not a billionaire, Dan. He's one of maybe 50 people in the country who measures wealth in generations, not dollars. Dan felt his stomach drop. And he's Carla's father, apparently. But she was a receptionist. She was nobody. She was living under an assumed identity. Victor's voice was hollow. And you had no idea. Dan turned to look at Carla. For the first time, she was looking back at him, and she was smiling. Peter approached the witness stand. Mr. Vance Thornwood, can you state your relationship to the defendant? Carla is my daughter. Raymond's voice was warm, cultured, with a faint trace of an accent that spoke of boarding schools and old European connections. My only child. Can you explain why she was living under a different identity when she met the plaintiff? Certainly. Raymond settled into the witness chair. When Carla turned 21, she came to me with a request. She wanted to know what it felt like to be ordinary, to be valued for herself, not for her family name or her inheritance. She asked for 5 years to live anonymously, to work real jobs, to meet real people. He paused, looking at his daughter with unmistakable pride. I agreed, reluctantly. I arranged for her to have a modest apartment, a modest job, a modest life. Her only condition was that I not interfere unless she asked. And did she ask? Once. Raymond's eyes moved to Dan. 3 years into her marriage, she called me. She told me she had made a mistake. She told me she had married a man who saw her as furniture. She asked if she could come home. The courtroom was utterly silent. I told her yes. Of course, yes. But Carla, my daughter, she's stubborn, like her mother was. She said she wanted to stay. She said she wanted to see who her husband really was, beneath the charm. She said she wanted to be sure before she walked away. And what did she discover? Raymond's gaze settled on Dan with the weight of judgment. She discovered that Daniel Whitmore is a man who measures human worth in dollar amounts, a man who discards people when they no longer serve his purposes, a man who is, in every way that matters, empty. Victor stood. Objection. Character assassination. Overruled. Judge Vance Thornwood didn't even pause. The witness is offering an opinion based on direct observation. Continue, Mr. Huang. Peter nodded. Mr. Vance Thornwood, do you have any knowledge of the plaintiff's financial dealings? I do. Raymond reached into his jacket and withdrew a thin folder. When Carla informed me she was being divorced, I asked my forensic accounting team to conduct a review of Mr. Whitmore's holdings. They found irregularities. Victor was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is improper. Any financial investigation should have been Mr. Ashworth. The judge's voice cut like a blade. Your client claimed in his filings that all assets were properly documented and disclosed. If that's true, then this investigation should reveal nothing of concern. Unless you're suggesting your client has something to hide? Victor sat down. Raymond continued. My team discovered that Mr. Whitmore has been systematically transferring assets into shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, Delaware, and Cyprus. Properties worth approximately $340 million have been hidden from these proceedings. Additionally, several accounts in his wife's name, accounts Carla was never told existed, have been drained over the past 6 months. He handed the folder to Peter, who submitted it as evidence. Your Honor, this folder contains banking records, corporate filings, and wire transfer documentation showing a pattern of deliberate asset concealment and potential fraud. Judge Vance Thornwood received the folder. She opened it, scanned the contents, and her expression, already stern, hardened further. Mr. Ashworth, I suggest you consult with your client immediately, because what I'm seeing here doesn't just affect the divorce proceedings. It suggests potential criminal liability. Dan was on his feet. This is ridiculous. She planted this. Mr. Whitmore. The judge's voice cracked like a whip. Sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Dan sat, but his eyes found Carla's across the room. She was still smiling. The next 3 hours were a systematic dismantling. Raymond Vance Thornwood's testimony was only the beginning. The forensic evidence was irrefutable. Dan had hidden assets, violated the terms of his own prenuptial agreement, and committed what amounted to financial fraud against his spouse. Victor Ashworth, sensing the ship was sinking, began distancing himself from his client. Your Honor, my firm was not aware of these discrepancies. We were operating on information provided by Mr. Whitmore, which we now understand may have been incomplete. Dan turned to Victor with betrayal blazing in his eyes. You're abandoning me? I'm protecting my firm, Victor replied quietly. You lied to us, Dan. You told us everything was clean. It was clean. $340 million in hidden assets is not clean. It's fraud. And I will not be party to it. Victor stood. Your Honor, Ashworth, Sterling and Moore is withdrawing as counsel for the plaintiff. We cannot in good conscience continue representation given these revelations. Judge Vance Thornwood nodded. So noted. Mr. Whitmore, you have the right to seek new counsel. However, given the severity of what has been presented, I am issuing an immediate freeze on all assets pending full forensic audit. Dan's face was gray. You can't do this. I can and I am. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, in my 38 years on this bench, I have seen every variety of dishonesty. Men who hide money, men who hide affairs, men who hide their true natures behind expensive suits and public smiles. She removed her glasses. But I have rarely seen anyone do it with such contempt for the person they swore to honor and cherish. You treated your wife like a servant. You flaunted your affairs in front of her. You systematically destroyed her self-worth while simultaneously hiding the assets that should be hers by law. Her voice dropped. And you did all of this while believing you were untouchable. You're not. She picked up her gavel. This court finds that the prenuptial agreement signed by Carla Whitmore was obtained under conditions of undue influence and inadequate disclosure. The agreement is hereby voided. Dan's sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Furthermore, based on the evidence of asset concealment and financial fraud, this court is awarding the defendant 70% of all marital assets, including properties, accounts, and investments currently held or hidden by the plaintiff. 70%. Dan did the math instantly. His empire was worth approximately $800 million. 70% was $560 million. She was taking everything. She was. Finally, the judge continued, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential criminal charges, including fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to conceal assets. Criminal charges. Dan felt his legs go weak. Court is adjourned. Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you find a criminal defense attorney. You're going to need one. The gavel came down like a gunshot. The courtroom erupted. Journalists scrambled for the exits, phones already to their ears. Victor Ashworth's team was packing up with the speed of people fleeing a crime scene. Meredith Callahan was nowhere to be seen. She had slipped out during the asset revelation, her diamond ring suddenly feeling very heavy. Dan sat frozen at the plaintiff's table. Everything he had built, everything he had schemed for, everything he had sacrificed, including his humanity, to acquire, gone. He looked up to find Carla standing before him. She was still wearing the simple gray dress. She still had no jewelry. She still looked like the quiet, unremarkable woman he had married 6 years ago. But her eyes were different. They were the eyes of someone who had been holding her breath for a very long time and had finally exhaled. Why? Dan's voice cracked. Why didn't you just tell me who you were? Carla considered the question. Would it have mattered? Of course it would have mattered. I would have. What? Treated me with respect? Been faithful? Loved me? She shook her head. You had 6 years to do those things, Dan. You didn't need to know my father's name to be a decent husband. But I didn't know. It's not fair. I didn't know. You didn't know I was rich. Carla's voice was soft but devastating. That's what you're saying. You didn't know I was worth something. And because you didn't know, you treated me like I was worthless. She leaned in close. That's exactly why I never told you. She straightened. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought no one was watching. When you thought there would be no consequences. When you thought you could do whatever you wanted to a woman you considered beneath you. She gestured around the empty courtroom. Now you know. And now the whole world knows. Dan grabbed her arm. Carla, please. We can work this out. We can. Raymond Vance Thornwood appeared at his daughter's side. His hand, gentle but immovable, removed Dan's grip. Don't touch my daughter, Raymond said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of generations. You forfeited that right the first time you made her cry. Two men in dark suits materialized behind Raymond. Security, private, the kind of people who didn't ask questions and never hesitated. Mr. Whitmore, Raymond continued, I'm going to offer you some advice. My attorneys will be very thorough in the coming weeks. Every asset you've hidden, every account you've drained, every shell corporation you've created, we will find it all. And when we do, what happened today will seem merciful by comparison. He guided Carla toward the exit. Wait. Dan's voice was desperate. Carla, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. Carla paused at the door. Yes, you did, she said quietly. That's the worst part, Dan. You meant every word, every dismissal, every insult, every night you came home smelling like another woman's perfume. You meant all of it. She looked at him one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope someone loves you the way you deserve to be loved. The way you deserved, not the way you gave. But I suspect that's going to be a very lonely search. The door closed behind her. Dan stood alone in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his empire and the echo of his own cruelty. The community service center on the Lower East Side was nothing like the penthouse Dan Whitmore once called home. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the smell of industrial cleaner mixed with old coffee. Plastic chairs lined the walls, occupied by people who had fallen on hard times. Addicts, homeless veterans, families who had lost everything. And one former billionaire wearing an orange vest, serving meals from a steam tray. Dan's criminal trial had been swift and brutal. The evidence Raymond's team had compiled was overwhelming. Hidden accounts, fraudulent transfers, perjury. The judge, not Patricia Vance Thornwood, but someone equally unsympathetic to wealthy men who thought the rules didn't apply to them, had sentenced him to 3 years in minimum security prison and 10 years of probation, including mandatory community service. The prison time had been surprisingly educational. Stripped of his suits, his status, his army of lawyers, Dan had been forced to confront something he had spent his entire adult life avoiding: himself. He didn't like what he found. The assets were gone, the properties sold, the shell corporations unwound and distributed according to the divorce settlement. Carla had donated most of her share to foundations supporting domestic abuse survivors and women seeking financial independence from controlling spouses. The irony was not lost on him. Meredith Callahan had married someone else, a tech entrepreneur from San Francisco, 6 months after Dan's conviction. Her Instagram photos showed a life of yacht parties and charity galas, the same life Dan had promised her. She never visited. She never called. She had never loved him, only what he represented. Dan understood that now. Too late, but he understood. The doors to the community center opened, letting in a blast of winter air. Dan looked up from the steam tray. A woman walked in, holding the hand of a small child. A boy, maybe 3 years old, with curious eyes and dark hair. The woman was wearing a simple coat, elegant but not ostentatious. Her hair was pulled back in a style that was practical, professional. She moved with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. It was Carla. Dan's hands froze on the serving spoon. She didn't see him at first. She was talking to the center's director, gesturing toward boxes being unloaded from a van outside. Donations from the look of it. Winter coats, children's clothes, things that would matter to people who had nothing. The little boy tugged at her hand. "Mama, I'm hungry." Carla smiled down at him. "In a minute, sweetheart. Let Mama finish talking." "But Mama..." "Here." A man appeared beside them, tall, kind-faced, with the easy bearing of someone comfortable in any setting. He scooped up the boy. "Let's go see what they're serving, buddy. Give your mom a break." Carla looked at the man with something Dan recognized immediately because he had never received it from her. Love. Real love. The kind that didn't need to be earned or performed. The man carried the boy toward the food line, toward Dan. Dan's heart pounded. He could step back. He could ask someone else to serve them. He could disappear into the kitchen and avoid this moment entirely. But he didn't. He stayed. The man reached the front of the line, the boy in his arms. "What'll it be, little man?" the man asked. "Mac and cheese," the boy declared. The man laughed. "Mac and cheese it is." He looked at Dan. "Could we get some mac and cheese, please?" Dan nodded. His hands trembled as he scooped the pasta onto a plate. The man took the plate, smiled politely, and started to turn away. "Wait." The word left Dan's mouth before he could stop it. The man turned back, curious but not hostile. Dan's voice caught. "I know who you are, who she is. I used to be... I was her husband." The man's expression didn't change. No anger, no contempt, just a steady, assessing gaze. "I know who you are," the man said finally. "Carla told me everything." Dan flinched, expecting what came next. The judgment, the accusation, the reminder of everything he had done wrong. But the man just looked at him with something Dan didn't deserve. Pity. "You had something precious," the man said quietly so the boy couldn't hear. "And you threw it away because you couldn't see its value. That's not something I can forgive you for, but it's something I can learn from." He shifted the boy on his hip. "I will never make your mistake. I will never take her for granted. I will never make her feel small so I can feel big." He paused. "So in a way, I suppose I should thank you. You showed her exactly what she didn't want, and that helped her recognize what she did." He walked away, carrying the boy toward a table where Carla was now waiting. Dan watched them sit together. Watched the man hand Carla a cup of coffee. Watched the boy show his mother a drawing he had made. Watched a family, a real family, share a meal in a community center that existed because people like Carla chose to give back. Carla looked up. Their eyes met across the room. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Carla gave him the smallest nod. Not forgiveness. That wasn't hers to give anymore. But acknowledgement, recognition that he was there, that he was trying, that perhaps some fragment of the man she once hoped he could be had finally emerged from the wreckage. Dan nodded back. And then he returned to serving food, one plate at a time, to people who needed it more than he ever had. And that, my friends, is the story of Dan Whitmore. A man who had everything and understood nothing. A man who measured love in transactions and people in usefulness. A man who stood in a courtroom and mocked his wife, certain that money and power would protect him from consequences. He was wrong. Not because Carla's father was wealthy, although that certainly didn't hurt, but because the universe has a way of balancing scales. Arrogance eventually meets its equal. Cruelty eventually returns to its source. And men who treat others as disposable often discover, too late, that they have disposed of the only things that mattered. Carla didn't destroy Dan. He did that himself. She simply stepped aside and let gravity do its work. And now she has everything he never gave her. Respect, love, partnership, and a family that sees her for who she truly is. Dan has something too. Not what he wanted, but perhaps what he needed. A second chance to become a better man. Whether he takes it remains to be seen. But that's the thing about karma. It doesn't just punish. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it teaches. So here's my question to you. Was Carla's silence throughout those 6 years patience or weakness? Did Dan deserve that final moment of acknowledgement? Or should she have looked right through him? And if you were the man Carla married, the good one, would you have said what he said? Or would you have simply walked away? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how we treat the people who love us, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe and tap that notification bell. Because next week, we have another tale of betrayal, justice, and the kind of karma that doesn't forget. Thanks for watching. And remember, the way you treat people when you think no one is watching, that's who you really are. See you in the next one.